Hello, everybody. Welcome to the sixth lecture of our book talk series, Spatial Practices in Chinese Art History and Visual Studies, organized by the Department of Chinese Culture of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. My name is Kathy Mack, Assistant Professor of Art History at the Department of Chinese Culture here at PolyU. Joining me organizing and hosting the talk today is my colleague, Dr. Pam Lu, Associate Professor specializing in cultural studies, also from the Chinese Culture Department. Lu and I have the idea of organizing this book talk series for two major reasons. First, both of us are interested in the role or the issue of space as opposed to time, not only as a historical question, but also as a method of investigating issues, problem in art history and visual studies. Second, both of us want to make use of the technology of video conferencing to create a platform where scholars and students can get together to discuss relevant questions in the field, and also to learn about some of the latest publication of relevant questions. So today is our great honor to have Professor Timothy Brook of the Department of History at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver to present to us his book. But Professor Brook just told us that he has modified the title of the talk today, and I think he will tell us more about it. So I believe a lot of attendees today know Professor Brook's work, so we may not need a comprehensive introduction. But for those who are slightly less familiar with his work, Professor Brook is an award-winning historian of China whose work has focused on the Ming Dynasty. His research also extends to issues that span the period from Mongol occupations of China in the 13th century to Japanese occupation of China in the 20th century. He has published more than 20 book manuscripts, and believe it or not, 15 of them are single authorship, and some of them are translated into Chinese and French. So his book, The Confusions of Pleasure, is a must read for everybody in Chinese studies. But perhaps slightly less known is that Professor Brook also utilized a lot of visual materials in his research. For instance, he has looked at the oil painting of the 17th century Dutch painter Vermeer, and study how details depicted in those paintings demonstrate networks of exchange, network of trade at the beginning of a global war. And Professor Brook also looked at Chinese postcard, and his research on map cartography that he's going to present demonstrate his interest in using visual material to interrogate different questions in history. So without further delay, please join me welcome Professor Timothy Brook.
How does that look?
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy, for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be back with Hong Kong students and colleagues. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. Maybe that will happen at some point in the future. I have a great fondness for Hong Kong, and particularly for the Hong Kong Polytechnic, where I first attended a workshop there, co-organized a workshop there about 8 years ago. So I've been watching Polytechnic, and I'm delighted that I've been asked to participate in this series. Particularly delighted that it's a series on art history and visual studies, because I'm a historian. I'm not an art historian, but as Kathy said in her introduction, I am interested in visual material, and I'm interested in how representations help me understand the way in which people at the time thought about themselves, their culture, their world. And for me, this is why maps have become interesting. I'm not a specialist in cartography, but I'm interested in the visual aspect of cartography, because that visual aspect provides us a route into the way in which people at the time thought about the world they lived in. And that world can be their home village, their home city. It could be all of China. It could be all of the world. And I'm going to be looking at different scales in my comments today. The book that is being referenced here is a book that came out of a set of 2 lectures I gave at Academia Sinica in Taipei in 2019. The book came out a year later. It's published by Academia Sinica, and I gather it's not widely available anymore. It's sold out, and perhaps there'll be some way to bring it back into print. The book, this was done for, these were done as lectures. And the first lecture looked at, one of my interests in visuality has to do with where do images come from? Images don't just come from nowhere. Every image is a copy of an earlier image, and every map is a copy of an earlier map. It adjusts, each map adjusts, changes, becomes different every time it's copied. This is the same the same is true of images as well. So I became interested because as a specialist in the late Ming dynasty, I became interested in the way in which Jesuit images of the world arrived in China, and then in the process by which Jesuit images and Chinese images interacted and influenced each other. So the book has two parts. Part one looks at European influences on Chinese cartography, and part two looks at Chinese influences on European cartography. And I was very concerned to strike a balance here, because in my earlier work, I did a book on the Selden map called Mr. Selden's Map of China. And in that book, I held back as long as I possibly could from saying this map was shaped by a European prototype, because this map is very much the creation of a Chinese cartographer thinking about how to map Eastern Asia. But in the end, I had to acknowledge that he must have seen a European map of this part of the world in the early 17th century in order to create the visual image that he has. But as I say, it's a conclusion that I delayed reaching because I wanted to understand the full agency of the Chinese cartographer. When I gave the two lectures in Taipei in 2019, I sort of relaxed about that issue because I could see influences going both ways. That Europeans were looking at Chinese images of Asia, just as Chinese were looking at European images of Asia, but also of the world. And it's that process that I address in this book, Completing the Map of the World. What I want to do in today's lecture is to think about where this visualization comes from. This, of course, is a map of the People's Republic of China. It was published in 1966. The quotation from Mao at the top of the map tells you that we've moved into the beginning of the Cultural Revolution for this map. And what intrigues me here is that this map seeks to reflect a geographical reality, but it's an image. It's not a thing. It's simply an image. An image is that has been constructed according to a particular projection, using particular colors, including parts outside of China that are thought to cohere together in the image of China that has become canonical now in China. This is the image that every Chinese, and actually everyone around the world, has in their head of what China looks like. Well, for me as a historian, this had to come from somewhere. This wasn't simply a randomly generated scientific production. It had to come from somewhere. And I'm going to propose slightly outrageously today that this is the origin, the more proximate origin we should go to understand the visualization that we have of China today. This is a map published in the in many versions in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. It's called the Qing, well, there it is, Qing Wanyan Yitong Tianxia Quantu, which I will refer to in my talk as the Qing Quantu, the complete map of the Qing Great State. The map, as I say, dates from the early 19th century. It is said to be based on a map from the 1760s. And what I want to do in my talk today is investigate where I think this map came from. It's clearly a map that focuses on China. The rest of the world is just sort of sketched in around the edge of China. China is the whole purpose of the map, or I should say not so much China, but the Qing Great State. This is a map of the Qing that celebrates the Qing as a vast territorial expanse. Well, this map had to come from somewhere. And that's what I'm going to try and talk about in my talk today. And I should say in my book, I include a version of the Qing Great State, but I don't really talk about it because when I published the book, I hadn't yet thoroughly investigated this map. And now I've given it more attention, and I think I've got some interesting things to say about the map that you see before you. This map was very popular. It survives in many forms. Here's, if you like, the cheapest form in which it survives, and that's in 8 panels, 8 printed panels, fairly roughly done. This is not a high-class, elegant production. It's a very cheap production. This one is actually dated 1814, so it's not the first version, but there are many versions of this map. Here's another version that's in better condition and has been hand-colored. This one dated 1821. Here's the famous blue map. This was a version that, it's a late version. It came out about 1823. As the Qing Great State had been circulating widely in popular copies, this version then came out. Very elegant, very surprising. There are certain prototypes in the Chinese map tradition that can account for this, but it's a very striking and unusual map. And every library in Europe and North America that could acquire one of these certainly did so. So that many copies of the so-called blue map survive. Here's the last. I've just pulled somewhat at random 5 versions of this map to give you a sense of how many different visual pictures you can derive from one map. So we call the Qing Great State one map, but of course it's as many maps as there are prints of this map, because every map is printed differently, it's colored differently, it's used differently. And so we have this huge body of maps of the Qing that were produced at the beginning of the 19th century. So what I'm going to do in my talk today is, first of all, talk about the Qing Great State a little bit. Then I want to look at possible influences from the Song, Yuan, and Ming, and then carry this into the early Qing and to try and understand where this way of visualizing China has come from. And I hope I've got some surprising things to show you. All right, so let's go back first of all to the Song. And for the Song, I chose 2 fairly representative maps of, I was going to say China, but it's not. These are not maps of China. These are maps of the world, and you'll notice that they're called the Yutu, maps of Chinese and barbarians. These are attempts to represent the known world in the Song period. So that China is featured. China fills most of the map, but you can see beyond China to Korea, to Vietnam, to India, to the Indian Ocean. You can see beyond the Great Wall. This is an attempt to represent the world in the Song dynasty. The Yutu tradition was a powerful one, particularly through the Ming. Into the Qing, it becomes more problematic because who's Hua and who's Yi? This changes when the Manchus take the throne, and the Manchus and the Mongols between them become the dominant, politically dominant ethnic minorities during the Qing dynasty. But the Yutu, this idea that China is roughly a rectangle outside of which the rest of the world is to be found. This model is a powerful one that goes back, of course, before the Song, but by the Song. This is, if a Chinese thought about what did China look like, China in the world look like, these would be the images that he or she would have in mind. When we move forward to the Yuan, we get a different image that constructs China as part of a larger world. This tradition of cartography derives from Persian and Arabic influences that reached China during the Yuan dynasty. This is a later Korean copy of one of those maps produced during the Yuan. And it shows China there, that China is very familiar. It's that sort of, there's a kind of a square there in the middle of the map that is China, recognizable from the Song period, Hua Yitu. But the world is opening up around China and is being arranged in a way that places China, it makes China just part of the world. China doesn't dominate the world anymore. The world is opening up around China. And visually, I mean, there are some interesting influences, I think, that you can detect here. The idea that the south coast of China simply bleeds off to the west without any perceptible Southeast Asia or Indian subcontinent. There's just a kind of a coast that gradually moves southwards across the bottom of the map, and then somehow joins up to the Indian Ocean, and that's Africa on the Gangnedo, using the Korean pronunciation. On this Gangnedo, you can see Africa, the Mediterranean Ocean, and Europe off on the far left-hand side of the map, and of course Korea on the right. And this is a Korean version, so Korea is a little larger than it is in reality. So this influence, I think, is detectable in terms of in part in terms of how the continent, the south and southeasterly part of Asia is drawn in the world. Now we move to the Ming, and the Ming pulls back from this more expansive view. The Ming still views itself as a great state in the Mongol tradition. The Ming map accepts that there are other parts of the world, but you can see that the other parts of the world are falling away in the Ming. The focus is very much back on China, and this larger vision is missing. However, there's a kind of, if you look at the Yuan version of China here, it's more or less carried forward in this Ming version as well. Let me give you another Ming map, and this is from Luo Hongxian's Guang yutu, which I consider China's first atlas. This is from the later 1566 edition. It was first published in the 1550s. And we're back to, really back to the Hua Yitu model of the Song dynasty. This is the Yudi Zongtu, the sort of comprehensive or general map of the Yudi, the land that is the earth chariot, and it harkens back to myths from the Zhou dynasty about the nature of the cosmos. And so the image of the Ming that emerges is sort of gradually moving away from the more global visualization of the Yuan dynasty. And then something happens. And this something that happens, I think, is best captured by this map, the Qian Wang Gua Quantu Gujin Renwu Shiji. This is a map by a schoolmaster, or allegedly by a schoolmaster named Liang Zhou. He's a schoolmaster in Wuxi. And it's a map that he creates, which seeks to be a map. This is, it looks, at first glance, and I used to use this in lectures many decades ago, as an example of how Ming Chinese viewed the world. That is, they only saw the Ming and they didn't see much of anything else. In fact, I was completely wrong. This is a map of the world. It's very consciously constructed as a map of the world. And if it seems conventional, the way in which it becomes utterly unconventional is what you see along the northern edge of the map. No map in Chinese history until this one shows the Arctic Ocean. So you've got the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean at the bottom, you've got the Pacific Ocean over on the right, but you've got the Arctic Ocean crossing the top. This is absolutely stunning. This is an innovation that the map maker could not ignore, because through the Jesuits, he learned that there is such thing as an Arctic Ocean. And if you go far enough north of Siberia, you're eventually going to find this body of water. So this is a map that is trying to make sense of the entire world. And it's there in the title, Wangguo Quantu, a complete map of the 10,000 countries of the world. Now, the publisher of this map, or the maker of this map, he gives his name as Liang Zhou. I have no reason to suspect that anybody named Liang Zhou actually existed, but perhaps he did. The reason I'm being a little suspicious about the map is that it includes a false date. It dates itself to 1593. 1593 is an impossible date for this map, because in the preface across the top of the map, he explains where he got his information. And in the text there at the top of the map, he says, and I'll do this in English, I have read the explanations on the map by the great master from the West. And by the great master of the West, he means Matteo Ricci. It is based on an engraving by a gentleman of Europa. He had no word for Europe, but Ricci used Oloba for Europe, and so Oloba is effectively the Latin term Europa. So the maker of this map, Liang Zhou, says Ricci based his map on a map by somebody from Europa. And the person from Europa is Ortelius, one of the great map publishers of the 16th century. And then he goes on his preface to say, several gentlemen of Nanjing had it translated and engraved in 6 panels. And we know this happened probably in 1600. It's difficult to put an exact date on it, but in 1600, a high official in Nanjing saw an earlier version of a map that Ricci had drawn of the world, probably in the late 1580s. And he sponsored the creation of a stone engraving that people could then come and rub to get a world map for the first time. So he says, several gentlemen of Nanjing had it translated and engraved in 6 panels. Now, for the first time, you can understand in the most precise degree how heaven and earth are contained. By this logic, it gathers together the many countries and shows what they constitute as a whole, and connects China and the foreign world, bringing them into a unity. So this cartographer was very excited. He had seen Ricci's map. And then what he had done is taken the information of Ricci's map and worked it into a version that made sense to him and would make sense to his viewers. And the underlining theme of my remarks for the next 5 minutes is that this is a commercial production. And in fact, this idea of a Wanhua Quantu is the production of the Nanjing publishing industry. These maps were not being produced anywhere but in Nanjing. Eventually, Fuzhou starts to produce some, and then Beijing will produce some later on as well. But this is really a Nanjing phenomenon. So here's the map on which Ricci based his version by Abraham Ortel, known as Ortelius, the Typus Orbis Terrarium, map of the sphere of the Earth of 1570. And the projection is quite unusual. It's called the pseudo-cylindrical projection or the Robinson projection. And what it does is it tries to emphasize the spherical nature of the world, but it extends the whole world across one stretched out sphere. And this becomes the visual model that Ricci then brings to China. This is a copy of possibly of his 1580, his first map of 1584. This is an image that circulates widely in the later part of the Ming Dynasty. Here's a sort of cleaned up version where you can see the parts of the world that Ricci has visualized for Chinese. And in fact, this image became so powerful that when the Italian government wanted to celebrate Italian-Chinese relations, they published a map and they put Matteo Ricci's face on they published a stamp in which showing Ricci's face and showing this particular map. And I like the fact that they showed the 1584 version, because you'll notice there's a channel of water that runs right across the middle of North America, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This was the Northwest Passage that explorers hoped to find in the 16th century and eventually gave up and realized that they were never going to find a water passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific, but they've preserved that in the Italian stamp, which I quite like. So Ricci produced a larger version of his map in 1600 in Nanjing, and this became the version that Nanjing publishers started to work with. By 1602, he's up in Beijing. He's produced a kind of a larger, even more complicated map of the world, and this is the version that is widely reproduced today. Now, all of this is interesting to me because I'm trying to understand European influences on the visualization of the world, not as derivative of European practices, but in fact as interactive with them. So there are many features of this map that are interactive in this way. The inclusion of the Arctic Ocean, for example. At the very top center of the map, you can see Beiji, the North Pole. This was a concept that was not meaningful until Ricci brought a European projection of the world. So the Liangzhou, or whoever produced this map, has done his best to take the information that Ricci has presented and make sense of it in terms of his own cultural tradition. So I view the map, rather than, I mean, it would be possible to view this map as a bad version of Matteo Ricci's map, and it's not that at all. It's a very creative adaptation of the map, which became immediately popular. Now, we can't date this map, unfortunately. As I said, he put 1593 as the date, which is impossible because Ricci didn't create his Nanjing map until 1600. So this probably dates from the first decade of the 17th century. And it's a creative amalgamation of European and Chinese traditions. The important thing, though, in terms of creating a new tradition of visualizing China in the world, is that this map becomes very popular and is widely copied and plagiarized by other Nanjing publishers. So this is one of those maps that is here in the University of British Columbia Library by Jiming Tai, the 九分页 yutu 古今人物史记. You can see immediately that this has been derived in consultation with the Liangzhou map. Look first of all at the overall design. There is a frame, there is text at the top, text at the bottom. There is a title box centered right at the top of the map, announcing a title for the map. And then within that frame, you see China in the world. Now in Jiming Tai's version, he's changed the aspect ratio. So he's widened the map and kind of compressed it a little bit from north to south. That compression means that he's decided to drop the Arctic Ocean. He doesn't explain this in his preface. And I think for him, he just couldn't, he had no way to visualize the Arctic Ocean because he couldn't really imagine the Arctic Ocean. There wasn't anything that he could draw on other than Matteo Ricci's map to understand what the Arctic Ocean was and where it was. So he decides to leave that off. He's doing the same sort of squared off framing that is reminiscent of the Song period Hua Yitu. And yet he's got all of these little texts embedded beyond the Great Wall, talking about the various regions that are out there beyond China. So it does, but he's changed the title. He's changed it to Zhouzhou. It's not Wanhua anymore. So it was 10,000 countries. Now it's the 9 provinces that are taken from the tributes of Yu. So he's casting it in a more traditional, he's using a language that is more traditional. And he's sort of maybe moving away a little bit from the idea that we are dealing now. We are dealing with the Wanhua, the 10,000 countries that make up the world. But still, I want to emphasize that this is I want to underline that this is a map of the world. He's given up Chuantu though. He's gone back to yutu, and this was the term that Luo Hongxian used and many others have used. So a map of the Earth chariot, which is conventionally used for just depicting China and maybe the adjacent parts around it. This map, it turns out Harvard has another version of this map. Harvard's version is a genuine one, dated 1643. This one is a pirated copy, probably pirated a year or two afterwards. They left the date off. But you can see that the format, the visual format that Liangzhou adapted from Ricci has been now translated into another version. But by far for me, visually the most exciting version of the Dachuan series that is now emerged in Nanjing is this map by Cao Junyi, the Tianxia Jiu Bian Fenye Renji Lu Cheng Quantu. Notice what's going on in the title. He keeps the Jiu from the Jiuzhou, but it's now Jiu Bian. So it's the 9 borders rather than 9 provinces, as much as to say China is bordered by China has borders that connects it to the rest of the world, and it's Tianxia. It is in fact a map of the world, and in many ways this is really more adventuresome than the Liangzhou map, because much more of the world has come into view, and I must say that the Africa looks a lot like the Yuan period Africa in the Cognito tradition as well. But you've got Asia and Europe and Africa are now surrounded by much more ocean. This is of course common in maps of China to show lots of ocean around China. But now what Cao has done is he's brought the ocean in around the entire group of continents here. He's also, for the first time, attempted to include a piece of North America. So up there in the upper right-hand corner, you see what is today roughly Alaska, which connects to a continent that is not shown in the map. But more surprisingly, he's decided to go back to the European design. So he's got lines of longitude running north and south. He's marked off steps of latitude along the outer perimeter of the map. And yet he still retained China as the central body of information that this map conveys. So the map is not very good at representing the rest of the world, but the rest of the world is out there. You can see Europe and the Mediterranean Ocean. You can see Africa. China is definitely now part of the world in a more comprehensive way than even the Liangzhou map was able to do. And then in 1645, Nanjing falls to the Manchus, and that's the end, for a while at any rate, of the Chantu tradition in Nanjing. In a dynastic tradition, you don't want to publish a national map because that raises very awkward questions about whose nation it is and who rules the nation and what it's called. So there's a kind of hiatus in Nanjing for a while. No maps of this sort are produced. They begin to be produced, however, further east in Suzhou and on the Yangtze Delta. So as we move from, oh, I'm sorry. Oh dear. I have, forgive me while I bring us back to where I was. There we go. Okay. Oh, but the one thing I will notice is, even though he's changed out the title, the preface that appears at the top of the map emphasizes Wangguo again. So as Jimingtai turns away from Wangguo, Cao Junyi comes back to Wangguo, and his preface is Wangguo Da Quan Tu Shuo. So, and the explication of the great, complete map of the 10,000 countries. And he starts the preface by saying, Yuezi Tu zhe, Wangguo Da Quan Tu ye. So he's telling his reader, this is what you're seeing. You are seeing a new genre that has emerged in Nanjing over the previous 3 or 4 decades, and it's the Wangguo Da Quan Tu. So the great complete map of the entire world, the 10,000 countries of the world. So he's quite happily identifying his vision of China as one in which China is one of 10,000 countries. This is more an intellectual than a visual contribution on his part. And yet, as I suggested, he shows much more of the world than any of the other Dachan maps of the world. But once the Ming is gone, then it takes a while before any publisher dares to publish a map, because it's not clear what the terms of the new dynasty are. And when the Qing Great State comes to power, nobody's sure what to call it, nobody's sure how extensive it is, and there's inadequate information about what that would look like. However, by 1663, Wang Junfu, and I suspect this is a pseudonym, I don't think Wang Junfu is a real person, he brings this map out, 天下九边万国人机路程全图. So the title is quite similar to Cao Junyi's, but he's changed it a little bit. No, actually, let me just go back to the title of the other one. I take it back. It is slightly different. But he's speaking of Tianxia, so everything under heaven, and this is not just the empire, but the world, and the Wanguo that are beyond the Jiubian. This is, so he's effectively reproducing Cao Junyi's map with a fairly safe title. There's nothing here about the Ming or the Qing. It's simply a picture of the world as it should look. Now, of course, by 1663, there are large parts of Manchuria and Mongolia that have become part of the Qing Great State, but this map, there's no evidence from this map that any of that has actually happened, because he's repeating an image that has already been established in the 1640s. So the Dachan tradition then comes into the Qing, largely repeating what the late Ming was doing. And there's he drops the lines of longitude, he drops the markings of latitude, he drops the spherical quality of Cao's map. He sort of squares it out again, and he doesn't know what to do with his corners, so he just put clouds in the four corners because he doesn't know what to put there. He doesn't want to curve it anymore, but he doesn't know what to do with it. But it's a fairly nice, clean replica of the Cao map. This is a map that then goes to Japan. So this is Umemura Yahaku's edition, which he dates 1663, but that's because he's stealing Wang Junfu's map. And the significant difference, well, there's a couple of significant, I think the most significant difference is in the title. Notice that Umemura calls it the Da Ming, the Ming Great State, because he's not under the authority of the Qing, and therefore he can talk about the Ming. And so for him, this is a map of the Ming. This is not a map of China. In fact, for him, this is, in some sense, it's a map of the world. Japan is certainly shortchanged, but it is a kind of map of the world for him. But it's a map of the world that features the Ming. And he uses Zhoubian, but he also goes back to Wanguo. So this is a map of the 10,000 countries of the world with the Ming at the center of the picture. And Japanese, Korean publishers weren't able to do this. It was, they were too much subject to Qing supervision to be able to publish a Da Ming map. But the Japanese could do it. There's many more versions of this map. But for Japanese, into the 18th century, this becomes a map of China. It loses its quality as a map of the world. And in fact, they prefer Ricci's map of the world as their map of the world. And they take Cao Junyi's version of the world to say, well, this is what China is. And there are more versions. This is a late 17th century version. This is Liu Junhan's map. This is a copy that's in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. At UBC, we have our own copy of this map done by another Japanese, Katsuragawa Hosan's edition of Miyagawa Chosun's copy of Liu Junhan's map. So it's a Japanese copy of the map that a publisher has then taken and reproduced. Now, you'll notice a lot of the interesting visual qualities have fallen away because this publisher and Liu Junhan's map appears to have been published in Beijing, although I'm not totally confident of that. It says it's published in Beijing, but I'm not totally confident that that's true. But this map is losing much of the interesting visual information that the earlier Dachuan, the Wangguo Dachuan tool included. It's sort of paring away the things that it doesn't understand and almost kind of taking us back to a late Ming version of the Chuan tool. And now I'm going to bring us back to the map with which I started, and this is the Daqing Chuan tool, which is allegedly based on a 1767 map by Hongxian. I hope that the examples that I've shown you now are giving you a sense that this visualization of the Qing is very much derived from the Chuan-tu tradition that the Nanjing publishers started in the late Ming. It's the mood of the map is different. It's a celebratory mood. It's a mood which celebrates the Great Qing State. It wants to emphasize the scale. So in fact, the rest of the world is being pushed to the margins, and China is opening out into this kind of glorious celebration of the Qing. Now, where this map comes from, it's said to be, and I'm using a different version, but it's roughly the same print. It says that this is a map created by Hongxian of Yao. Now, Hongxian, also known as Huang Zhengsun, is the grandson of the eminent intellectual Huang Zongxi. And what this little preface to the Daqing Chuan Tu says is that the original, that the publisher got a copy of Huang Qianren's map, and then he's added all kinds of new material in order to turn it into a different map. And this is certainly true. I have not been able to see a complete reproduction of Huang Qianren's original. There is a copy in Beijing. It hasn't been properly published. I was able to pull this fragment of it out of a Chinese publication. So at least I know that the map does exist, but visually this map is reminiscent of late Ming maps and really doesn't have much to say about the Qing. Now, there's another troubling element in this story, and that is that in his preface, Huang Qianren says that he developed his map on the basis of a map in his grandfather's collection. This has led map historians then to say, oh, it's based on a map designed and created by Huang Zongxi. As far as I can tell, this is simply not true. There is no evidence that Huang Zongxi was a cartographer, nor is there any evidence from the fragment I can see of Huang Qianren's map that Huang Zongxi has done anything except collect one of these Dachuan maps from one of these Chuan-tu maps from the late Ming. So I think the story here is, in fact, it's a very direct legacy from the Chuan-tu of the late Ming. One of those is in Huang Zongxi's collection. Huang Zongxi's grandson takes that Chuan-tu, adapts it minimally for his map, and then a publisher in the early 19th century, who to this day is still unnamed. We can't figure out who came up with this design, but a publisher in the early 19th century then expanded this Chuan-tu into the map we have now. So Huang Zongxi gets his name in the history of cartography, and I'm afraid all he did was own one of these chantu. He didn't actually design it. So let me just sum up some of what we've looked at by looking at the nomenclature. I've given you some of the titles that I've mentioned in the course of this talk, just to give you a sense of the patterning of language, because we're dealing both with visual images, but we're also dealing with labeling. And the way in which we read visual material is shaped, constrained, and directed by what we are told it is visual material of. So there's some interesting patterns in these titles. Ricci starts with the term chantu, and I have not been able to find a single Chinese map predating Ricci that uses the term chantu. This is Ricci's contribution to the Chinese mapping tradition. So his first map is a Shanhai chantu, complete map of, I would say, continents and oceans, not mountains and seas, but continents and oceans, a complete map of the world. Then when he produces his larger vision in 1600 and 1602, it's the Wanguo Chantu. It's the complete map of the 10,000 countries. Liang Zhou picks up Wanguo Chantu. Jimingtai backs away. He drops Wanguo and he goes back to the yutu expression. And in fact, the Jimingtai's map comes in two different versions. The Harvard version is Ming as in illumination. The UBC version is Ming as in renown. But both of them use yutu and neither of them touch Wanguo or Chantu. However, Cao Juni goes back to Chantu and uses instead the term Tianxia. Wang Junfu in 1663 uses Chantu, but he reintroduces Wanguo, which Cao had dropped. And then Lu Junhan in Beijing backs away again and goes back to yutu, perhaps for political reasons, because the yutu is a kind of safer, it's a safer term that doesn't imply anything about the outside world. I've highlighted the middle character Jun in those three names because I suspect Cao Juni might be a real person, but I suspect Wang Junfu and Lu Junhan are not real people. What they are doing, and this is common in publishing, if you're pirating somebody else's map, you want to give the viewer the sense that they might be getting something like the original. So you subtly repeat elements of the earlier maps. And then finally, we get down to Huang Qianren's map, or I should say the 19th century version of Huang Qianren. I should have put Huang Qianren in parentheses or quotation marks. And we find that we are back to the Chantu. So Huang Zongxi's map was obviously a Chantu map. And so Huang Qianren keeps the term Chantu, and the 19th century publisher keeps it too. So it's a complete map of the world. But it's not Wanguo. He's switched out Wanguo and put in Wanyan. So it's a map. It's no longer a map of the 10,000 countries of the world. It's a complete map of the 10,000 years of the Qing Great State. The Wan character is important because the idea of a Wanguo Chantu has become established. It's in the minds of literate Chinese. So Huang Qianren wants to keep Wan in there to connect himself to that tradition, but he can't call it Wanguo because the mood in the Qing is very much a kind of triumphalist mood in which the Qing exists on its own terms. And of course, all political formations like to pretend that they are permanent and forever. The Qing thought it was going to exist for 10,000 years. Of course, it doesn't, but that's all right. It's just political jargon. But that's part of this history of images. It's the history of the naming of the images. So this is a highly simplistic rendering of some of the things I've talked about in this talk, but we start with Ortelius. We go to Ricci. And Ricci, of course, reverses Eastern and Western hemispheres for his Chinese viewers. Then we go to Liangzhou, and Liang sort of forces Eurasia into a kind of squared off format that ignores the rest of the world, but includes the Arctic Ocean. This then goes over to Cao, where Cao tries to, in fact, respect the information in the Ricci map in a way, but without sacrificing the centrality of China to the map. And then we come down to Huang's map, which derives in part from what Liangzhou was doing, but maybe less from what Cao was doing. It perhaps takes some of the southern part of Cao and some of the northern part of Liang, but on the other hand, it leaves out the Atlantic Ocean. So in the end, the Qing Great State is a step back from the worldization that went on in with the Nanjing publishers of the late Ming. But at the same time, it is a very expansive and inclusive map that goes well beyond the range of the Qing. And now for something that that suggests there's perhaps an even stronger Ortelian influence in this map. And that comes if you look at the leftmost and rightmost panels of the Qing Great State. You'll notice the section in the middle looks like almost any Great State from the late Ming forward stretched out a little bit to account for the westward expansion of the Qing state. But there are these lumps of land at either end of the map that are somewhat incoherent. I mean, at the right-hand side, where Korea appears, and then Korea just bleeds into this massive landmass off to the east. And in the same way, once you get over to the west, bits of Europe appear. Those orange islands up in the top left-hand corner have names like Holland and England and things like that. But there's also this kind of undifferentiated landmass that comes in from the west. Comes in from the west. Well, to me, visually, the best way to explain these inclusions is to go back to other maps by Ortelius. If you look at the map on the left, you've got the continent of Asia bleeding into Europe, but with Europe and Africa sort of stuck off there to the left-hand side, bleeding off the left-hand side of the map, which is exactly what is happening, not exactly, but it's similar to what is going on the left-hand side of the Qing Great State map. And in the same way, on the right-hand side, Ortelius starts to bring in the Americas. And so the right-hand side of the Qing Great State is acknowledging that there is a massive body of land somewhere off to the east. Now, whether I have no idea whether the publisher of this map ever saw these other maps of Ortelius, but the important thing about the visuality of maps is that it's really hard to make things up when you draw a map, because you're striving to create an image that is coherent and that accords with the best knowledge that is available to you. So you know there are masses of land, some are off to the west, some are off to the east, but how you visualize that requires a precedent, because every map is a copy of other maps. No map simply arises from nothing. Every map comes from other maps. And so this is my final slide, in which I've attempted to share with you some of my perceptions as I look through European and Chinese maps from the 16th century forward of what is going on here. That Ortelius creates an image of the world based on a geometrical model that was unavailable to Chinese cartographers. It's brought in through the Jesuits to a Chinese kind of map known as the Quantu. And I would be willing to argue in a very loose sense that the vision that Quantu creates is the vision that is then captured in the map of China that we have in our heads today. So well, I hope I've made 2 points here. One is that map makers work from visual precedents, visual antecedents. They have to work with what is familiar or their map will be rejected visually. But at the same time, as the world comes into view, they have to allow it to come into view without sacrificing Chinese identity, because that is where their knowledge is. Chinese map makers before the 20th century had very little knowledge of the outside world. And so they needed to respect the information they had about China in a way that could accommodate the rest of the world, and rather than letting the rest of the world compromise the information that they had. And this is, to me, I think, an interesting example of how images travel down to us through time. And I will end my lecture there.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brook, very much for your very stimulating, very rich talk. I'm sure we have all learned a lot from your presentation. So Liu and I will have a conversation with Professor Brook for about 15 minutes, and then we will have open it up for Q&A. So audience are welcome to type their question in the chat box. We will turn to your question later on. In terms of time, I think we are doing fine. All right. So I'm very interested in the way how visual representations of territory, demonstrate shifting ideas, perceptions of relationship between China and territories surrounding. And so it's very interesting, particularly when you show 2 maps, that demonstrate a transition. So one was Jiming Tai's map that utilized the word 九州, 9 provinces in the map. And then when it shifted to Cao Junyi of late Ming dynasty, he used the word 九边, 9 garrisons in his map. And I can see that Cao Junyi has emphasized the portrayal of the Great War. He made it, align it parallel to the top edge of the map. And also I believe he has include the portrayal of 9 garrisons in the map as well. And it's interesting when you shift to maps, for instance, produced by a cartographer in Qing dynasty, Huang Qianren, the representation of the Great War has become slightly more fluid. It's no longer, aligned parallel to the top edge of the map, is more organic. And also the eastern edge of the Great War is not connected all the way to Shanghai Guang, which is actually the easternmost garrison of the Great Wall, and that Shanghai Guan was shown in some of the previous map produced in the late Ming dynasty. So I was wondering if you have any have anything to say about it, and I would like to look back slightly more about the portrayal of 9 provinces. How was the idea of 9 provinces visualized in the map of Jiming Tai?
Well, yes, this is a very good point. The late Ming Nanjing Chuantu tend to accentuate the Great Wall, and I don't have a good way of explaining that to myself. If we go to, am I still screen sharing at this point?
If you can make it a full screen, that would be better.
To do, okay. Yes. So if you look at this, the Luo Hongxian's map, which is it is the authoritative 16th century map of China, there isn't any Great Wall at all. He doesn't put it there. But it comes in Liang Zhou's map. It's quite clearly delineated. Does Ricci put it into his map? I don't think he does. But there it is. Liang Zhou, Jiming Tai doing the same thing. He even puts crenellation in it. Really, it emphasizes the northern boundary, and Saojuni does too. So the Great Wall, this needs more thought, but the Great Wall becomes a kind of signature of China's presence in the world in a way in which it really wasn't before the Nanjing, the Nanjing publishers started producing these Chuantu. And you're absolutely right. When we get down, so it continues on until we get to, until we get to this map. And you're absolutely, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. It kind of fades away. And in fact, excuse me, I'm just going to, trying to rearrange my screen so that I can see this better. Yeah, it's hardly there at all. And in many ways, it's going back to Luo Hongxian, because Luo Hongxian's northern boundary for the zone that is China is desert. And that orange stretch that runs across the map is desert. So Hongqianren has gone back to the idea that China is separated from the rest of the world by a desert, not by the Great Wall. And it's a good question that needs to be thought about. I don't have a great answer for you, but it's something that I've been aware of, but haven't been, I don't have a good answer for you yet. I think we need to do some more research to figure this out.
All right, thank you.
I will also note in the same vein that the rivers, the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, are highly accentuated in this map. Whereas if we, no, I'm going the wrong way again. Whereas if we go back here, the rivers are accentuated, but they're less significant to the map than the Great Wall is. So it's an interesting puzzle for somebody to think about.
So Liu, do you have a question?
Okay, because I'm seeing more and more questions are coming. I would just throw out really two very quick questions for Professor Brook. And yeah, it's really fascinating. I particularly like the idea you talk about the mood of the maps, and it's not only have its narrative but a mood. I have two quick questions. The first one is the relation between the texts on the map and its representation. It's a visual representation because you talked about the change of the title and maybe the ways of projection and everything. So do you notice any changes of the text renditions that goes around these maps? The first.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question. It's fascinating to read. All of these maps have a what I call a preface. It's a shu across the top of the map. Every one of them, they all talk to each other in a sense that each one plagiarizes, rephrases, steals, mixes around what the previous map talked about. And it's almost as though after this first, well, it's the earliest Chuantu that we have, this one by Liang Zhou. He runs this text across the top. His text, in part, plagiarizes Li Zhizao's preface on Matteo Ricci's 1602 map. So we know that this map has to be after 1602 because his text steals parts of Li Zhizao's preface from 1602. And then Jiming Tai steals material, well, I shouldn't say steals, but uses material that Liang Zhou does, and Cao Junyi does the same thing. So the text, which makes it interesting you have to ask, well, what is the text doing? And the text is establishing authority for the map. And it's establishing authority in some sense by simply being there. Like if you didn't have that text, your map wouldn't compete with maps that did have the text because it looks kind of authoritative. So you need to have a text across the top. Sometimes the text is significant. Sometimes the text is a bit nonsensical. I mean, the one across the top of is it Cao Junyi's? Yeah, it's Cao Junyi's text. he starts out by saying, this is the Guang Da Chuantu. And then he talks about the information in it. And he goes back to the old conventions about the tributes of Yu. He lists the states, the states that sent tribute to the Ming dynasty. He talks about the transformation of 10,000 things in the I Ching. He goes back to a kind of traditional body of knowledge that has no bearing whatsoever on this map. But he needed to come up with some text. So he kind of just recycled some geographical talk. But then he finishes that by saying, plus on this map, you can see the South Pole, the North Pole, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic, they're all here. And this is the most complete map that you can possibly find. So these prefaces require actually much closer textual analysis than I've done on them. At some level they're insignificant to the image, but at another level it's the contradictions between the text and the image that can be quite fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. And the second question might be related to what you talk about the mood, but I'm not sure because you said there's this shift from, for example, 天下九边 or 万国 to 历代分野 or finally to 万年一统. I noticed there's what I would call this temporal turn of this naming. Like previously, it's more spatial, as we understand map as something more about the space. But then the naming changed to something more temporal, related to time. So I found this is a really interesting shift. So I wonder, except for the titles, what are other things you might notice in these later maps that also have this temporal turn? Yeah.
That's an interesting observation. A map maker has the decision to make about whether he's going to show his subject as it is at the time, or whether he's going to layer it with its past to show events in the historical past. And this was particularly attractive to late Ming map makers. They like to put in information about the past, linking locations on the map with events in history. That became a sort of a way to fill in the map, let the map contain more information than simply geographical information. They like the idea of building in historical information. The constraint, though, has to do with the authority of the reigning dynasty. So once you're in the Qing, you can't refer to the Ming. That's simply unacceptable. And in a sense, what the Daqing Chuantu is doing is it's trying not to look back. It's actually looking forward. So the Qing is going to be around for 1 yen. So here's the Qing today, and we can look forward to 10,000 years of the Qing Great State. And that'll be great. So in some ways, even though the title is temporal, there's a kind of reluctance to look into the past, because the past will potentially undermine or raise questions about the present that the map maker doesn't want raised. But it's a good point. I mean, the first historical atlas is done in the Song. It's I had an image from that, the Lidai Zhizhangtu, in which the cartographer goes back and tries to see what the world looked like back in the Zhou and the Han and so forth, and comes forward. It covers temporal changes all the way up to the Song. The curious thing about that exercise, though, is that it idealizes China as the same space, because no matter whether you're talking about the Han or the Wei or the Tang or the Song, he uses exactly the same map for every dynasty. So it stabilizes China. China moves through time, but China is always the same thing over time. What's a little disturbing about the Daqing Chuantu is that China hasn't stayed the same. That even though, I mean, if I can, sorry to do this to you all, even if I can take you to these 17th century maps, the maps that are produced, well, maybe I should put this one in, that's produced under the Qing. I think it's commemorating the Ming. It doesn't say that it's doing that. It wouldn't dare say that it's doing that. But I think this is a map that is intended to commemorate the Ming because it denies that anything has changed. There's the Great Wall marching across the top as though everything were in place as it always has been. And then when we get to this map, well, this is a map that celebrates the fact that China, the Qing is no longer the Ming. The Qing is now a new space. It's opened up, it's spread out. And that's why I spoke of this map as being celebratory. So it's both space and time that are at work in these images.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. So I think we can turn to, sorry?
If I am allowed to ask a very quick question. So Professor Brook, you have mentioned actually in your book that there was a false advertising in some of those Ming Dynasty maps, because when the Ming Dynasty cartographer, when they constructed a trend to a complete map, they have included terms in words in the title like 古今人物事迹, right? So it seems that the idea of including or articulating the ideas of people, events of present and the past was important for cartographers in Ming Dynasty in order to create a sense of complete map. And I was particularly struck by this map, which you have shown, the Japanese map. So the idea of including the idea of people, and events was also included in the Japanese map. So I was wondering if you have a moment, have a chance to think about it more deeply since the book was published.
Well, this is, you ask a troubling question because several of these maps talk about Lucheng. So Lucheng are routes that you could take around the empire, starting with the postal routes. Not one of these maps includes any information whatsoever about route maps, about routes. And yet saying, so that's why I put it in terms of sort of advertising, say you're going to find historical information, you're going to find routes, everything you could want to find is here. Well, it isn't there. The historical information is skimpy. It's mostly information about locations, not about renji, not about what the remains of what the evidence of what people did. There's very little of that in these maps. There's nothing in these maps whatsoever about routes. And so, I haven't found a good explanation for why these titles suggest that the maps include things that they don't include. And I think my problem is that I haven't figured out what that meant to a late Ming viewer. If a late Ming viewer saw Renji Lucheng in the title, what would that mean to that viewer? And I haven't been able to determine that, but it's a puzzle.
All right. Okay, sure. So we look forward to see if we are able to find out more about that later in the future. So we have a lot of questions, so maybe we can switch to question posed by the audience. So first one by Irina Camus. This person asked, interesting that Liang Zhou gave a false date. Any motive for this?
Yes. Now, I'm sorry. Just done something funny here. Give me. Yes, where did he go? There he is. I think the reason he gives a false date is that he didn't create this map. He's plagiarizing another publisher's map. So and we don't know what it is because this is the earliest Chantu I've been able to find. My guess is that an earlier cartographer and publisher came up with the first adaptation of the Ricci map to Chinese cartographic traditions. And Liang Zhou is plagiarizing that map. So he has to fudge the date. He can't, if somebody brought out a map in 1604, he can't say, well, my map is 1606. because everybody will say, well, you just plagiarized the previous one. So he puts 1593 back. It's just a completely outrageous thing to do. And I think it's done because of, for what today we would call copyright issues. He's denying plagiarism. And in fact, there's a nice touch, if you can see on your screen, down in the bottom left-hand corner, it says, 不许翻刻. So it's not allowed to reprint this map. You cannot reprint this map. And I think he put that in because that's exactly what he's done. He's reprinted somebody else's map. That's why I'm suspicious that there is nobody called Liang Zhou, that he's a made-up name. He's a publisher who's pirating another Nanjing publisher's Chuantu. But until a couple of years ago, nobody was looking for these Chuantu. These Chuantu were just sort of late Ming oddities. And I'm hoping, my hope is that with having published the book, there will be more of these Chuantu will come forward, and we can create a more careful history of the Chuantu tradition between 1600 and 1644.
Okay, next question is posed by Yongxi Wang. So it's about the intended audience. How widespread were these maps circulated when these maps were made? Who would read these maps at that time?
Good question, for which we have almost no evidence. There's very little textual evidence about these maps, but I'm going to answer, if you like, not from any practical information, but from a more idealized position, which is that these maps were large. So this one is 132 centimeters across, 175 centimeters up and down. This is a large map. So therefore, in my view, it's meant to be displayed. It's something that you put on the wall, or it's something you unfold and put on a table. It's something to be seen and enjoyed. It's because, I mean, maps on this scale are effectively useless. You can't look at this map and figure out how to get from Nanjing to Beijing. It's not going to get you there. You're going to be lost. You'll never get to Beijing from Nanjing using one of these. That's not the purpose of the map. The purpose of the map is to express something that matters to people at the time. And one of the arguments I make in completing the map of the world is that the intellectual world of the late Ming was experiencing considerable uncertainty and anxiety about what exactly was the nature of the Chinese realm, what exactly was the nature of the world, what was out there, what was China's relationship to the rest of the world. And you have, of course, many philosophical movements that are challenging certain kinds of authority, the authority of Confucius. You've got Wang Yangming and the influence that he had intellectually. So it's a time of uncertainty and unclarity. But I think, so that's maybe what the intellectual world is doing in the late Ming. You also have to remember there is a large commercial world. In the 1620s, 100,000 Chinese are leaving South China every year to go out into around Southeast Asia to work, to trade. There's an enormous amount of foreign trade that is underway. And I think people must be getting curious about the larger world and curious about what is China's relationship to the rest of the world. So I would say you don't even have to be literate to want to, excuse me, to want to own one of these maps. And because it's the visual element that you want to look at. If you are literate, you can read all the bits and pieces, but I think even illiterate people would enjoy the map. And if I can add one more thing to this, it's that how can I put this? The fact that so many of these maps are plagiarized. The map in the UBC library is a pirated copy. Liang Zhou's is a pirated copy. These maps were being pirated you only pirate something that sells well. So my sense is that these maps were selling really well, and a lot of fly-by-night publishers decided to get into the business of printing these maps because there was a market for them. Unfortunately, there's almost no reference to how people thought about or used these maps. That requires more research on my part. I haven't been able to find it so far.
Luo, would you like to read the next?
But maybe I'll also add that somebody like Wang Zhongxi also thought it was worth owning one of these maps too, because he had one in his collection. We don't know which one, but he had one of these in his collection.
Okay, so Carrie Cox want to know, in the green and the orange trend tool, what does the orange part represent?
There we go. I'm a little puzzled here. The orange at the top is what we might today call the Gobi Desert. And it's a long stretch of desert that is a break between China and Siberia and Russia. But then it extends down into the west and extends all the way out. It's as though the desert goes all the way out to the Mediterranean, which makes no sense whatsoever. Then all the islands are colored orange. And I should say that this, this is a version of the map that was sold by a rare book dealer. So I haven't been able to examine it. I assume that it was hand colored. It wasn't printed this way, that somebody, for some reason, has colored in the Gobi Desert and then colored in all the islands. And it's funny, I was looking at this map earlier today and thinking, why are the orange bits orange? I have no idea. And if anyone can come up with a good idea, I'd really like to hear about it, because I think it's marking what lies beyond. Perhaps I can put it that way. Like all of those islands down in the ocean, those are all other places. Those are not the Daqing. And the desert is to some extent what lies beyond the outer limits of the Daqing. So they may be sort of marked as foreign, if you like, or as places where China has ended and something else has started. But that's simply a guess. I don't know.
Okay, and Lampo said, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm curious about the transition from the late imperial map to the PRC map, which there's a gap in the between. So how the Republic reconceptualized the nation, which was maybe having a new idea.
Yes, that's a very sensible question. I included the 1966 map almost as an afterthought, but one of the things that, and yes, to do this proper, I'm just going to go back to this. To do this properly, one needs to fill in the gap between the 1810s and the 1960s. Republican era cartography is much more, if you like, how can I phrase this properly? I wanted to say more scientific. It's using sort of international standards for latitude and longitude, and it's using the standard projections that have been developed to map large areas. But I think the reason I decided to throw in this 1966 map has to do with the way in which there's a visual shape. The shape of the Daqing Chuantu has this kind of east-west spread, and that to my eyes is slightly curved, and it made me think of the map of the People's Republic of China. This may be an inappropriate, and yes, steps need to be filled in along the way. What happens in the late 19th century is a lot of this more traditional styling is lost, although it lingers on in some early Republican mapmaking. But generally, Republican mapmakers wanted to be meeting global standards. They weren't interested in creating images that had a kind of cultural familiarity. That wasn't what they were doing. They were scientific map makers. And in fact, that's what PRC map makers are doing here too. This is a very scientifically created map, but it's interesting that this is the favored projection, and I've forgotten what this projection is called. It's slightly curved. It's trying to take account of the curvature of the Earth's surface, of course, but it does so in a way that reminds me of the Daqing Chuantu map maker had no way to account for curvature or to represent curvature, but he was perhaps echoing the way in which the Ortelian world map curves in order to take account of the sphericity of the world. And I think that comes visually into the Daqing Chuantu in a kind of subtle way. And here we are with, I mean, the People's Republic map could be done with a different projection, but this is the projection that is generally favored. This one in which there is a curvature. And I will finally say that this was just a sort of a late thought that I added onto the lecture, because I think these images, the way when we read the Daqing Chuantu, we have the Renmin map in our head, and we're sort of seeing, we look from the present, we see through the image of China in the present to images in the past. And it's interesting just to have that perspective lingering in our ways of looking at China.
We still have some questions. So one asked by Yongling Jiang. I'm curious how the Ming Qing maps were made. In addition to copying earlier maps, did Ming Qing map makers do actual geographical investigations?
Yes, and we have good evidence for that. Luo Hongxian himself, when he was developing his atlas, was working on the ground, doing surveys. He starts actually doing tax surveys in Jiangxi province, and then that leads him to build his atlas. When you get up to a kind of national map or a world map, the scale is so huge that nobody is doing, to my knowledge, no Chinese map maker is calculating geographical shapes on the basis of on-the-ground observation. The one exception, and which is why it so attracted my attention, is the Selden map, because we know that the Selden map was designed by someone who took account of distances between points in Eastern Asia and created a map that respected the real distances. He couldn't do anything with curvature. He had no way to account for curvature, but he could account for distances. And so he measured those distances, or he had measures for those distances, and designed his map around those distances. That's why the Selden map is rather unique, because the other maps, generally you simply copied what was already there and added anything else that you knew. At the national level, there aren't surveys. Go down to the county level, and one of the interesting impacts of the single whip reform, when taxation, the whole taxation policy of the Ming, which shifted to a unified taxation in silver, is that they had to remeasure land. And so there are a lot of county maps that are drawn in the 16th century on the basis of on-the-ground observations. I'm trying to think who writes about this. I think Haire writes about this, in fact, that of being down there on the ground, measuring how high a hill is, where the fields are, and so forth. This was done down at the county level, but to my knowledge, nothing was done at a higher level.
Okay, next question. Nianshen Song asks, could you elaborate a little bit more on the commercial aspect of Chuantu series? From Chuantu tradition to the contemporary map, there was also another tradition created by the French cartographers in the Kangxi period, which had not been very much commercialized. Do you think the Kangxi Atlas tradition at some point, in some way, merged with the Tiantu tradition?
That's a very good question, because the surveys that were done under Kangxi were superb. they were done on the ground. This was a very careful surveying that was done that fundamentally redrew the Chinese atlas. But these did not circulate widely. They got some attention from European cartographers, but there was one copy, for example, in the King's Library in London. There was a copy in the King's Library in Paris, so that they didn't get out into European cartographic circles as much as they might have. And in China, they seem to have been sequestered inside the imperial family, inside the Forbidden City. So Chinese map makers didn't have easy access to these maps, and therefore weren't reproducing them. It would have been great if they did. It would have been lovely if a commercial Chinese publisher got his hands on one of these Hongxian atlases and produced an inexpensive copy for people. But that didn't happen. And I think this has something to do with the fact that the Manchu court was very careful to sequester Jesuit scientific knowledge inside the court. In Matteo Ricci's time in the late Ming, the Jesuits are out among the people, and what they are doing is having a popular impact. Under the Qing, they are sucked up into the Forbidden City. They work for the Manchus. They produce knowledge, geographical knowledge in this case, for the Manchus. But this is not information that is being spread out into society, and it's a lost opportunity, because that would have changed the course of Chinese cartographic history had the Hongxian Atlas been produced on a commercial scale.
Okay,
I think the next question has already been answered, so I will skip to the next one from Angie Becker. So can you speak about the Ferdinand Webst map of 1674, Kunyu Quantu? Do you think it fits into the Quantu lineage of maps at all? Separately, can you speak to the imagery in the marginalia of the maps? The Webst maps have depictions of fantastic images and some ethnographic style representations of peoples. Is there any notable animal or figurative imagery in the marginalia of the Quantu maps?
The short answer is no. And this is curious. Japanese map makers picked up on this kind of thing. So Japanese maps that in the wake of the Jesuit cartography that reached Japan tended to pick up features of European cartography, like showing couples from different places in the world, how a man and a woman dressed from Thailand or from Taiwan or from wherever. This is not a practice that Chinese cartographers, for some reason, Chinese cartographers did not find this interesting. And whereas European map makers notoriously filled empty spaces with strange creatures, sometimes completely imaginary, sometimes realistic, but mostly quite imaginary, this is not something that Chinese cartographers did. And that requires more reflection. It's an interesting question. It's one that I hadn't thought of posing myself. So thank you for mentioning that.
Okay, next one by Tingting Xu. I noticed that the contour of the continent in Liang Cao Ji's map, if they could be grouped as siblings, especially in the protruding coastal line of southern China, does not resemble the shape of the Ricci's map. This makes me think that Ricci's map might not be a direct reference of them, or maybe not the only one. I'm wondering what you think of this. Shall we look at them more closely together?
So if I take us back to the Liangzhou map, the southern coast is a sort of a series of odd little curves that shows nothing like what we would know as Southeast Asia, and instead just kind of curves around to India without really showing a coastline. This has struck me as odd, but I think what it does is that it's at a popular level, if I can speak this way, at a popular level, the Chinese idea of what China looked like was very much in this mode. Now, Luo Hongxian here does extend his southern coast downwards in a way that indicates Southeast Asia, but many other maps don't. Because there was not until when, I'm not sure I want to put a date on it, but before this, well, before the 15th, no, I keep wanting to push it back. There was extensive knowledge of Southeast Asia in some parts of Chinese society before this time. But let's just look at some of these. No, if anything, this makes me think of the Kangnido tradition, the Jiangnitu, that there is a representation of the southern part of Eastern Asia that kind of effaces Southeast Asia, it effaces India. These places simply disappear, and that seems to be familiar, even a comfortable image of what the southern seas look like. I mean, I wouldn't want to press this too far, because by the turn of the 17th century, there were many Chinese who were sailing those seas and had a good knowledge of what the coastline looked like. So, but again, I think the place to go to understand something that strikes us as so different from geographical reality is you have to look at earlier images and look at I mean, I've just pulled a couple out here. You have to look at as many prior images, prior maps of China to try and see what the appeal was of this image and why this is how the southern coast of China was visualized.
All right, we have about 3 more questions to go. Would you like to answer them, Professor Brook? You must be tired.
If we could be quick, I'm willing.
Okay. All right. So question asked by Claudia Mercier. Are there linguistic research, or have you checked the different writing of the foreign toponyms, and do they give hints of the way of handing down the maps?
That's not a path that I've followed, but it would be a good one to do. There has been considerable attention to the Kangnido tradition, to trying to understand where place names come from and how place names evolve. We have there is a scholarship on foreign place names in the Ming. It's a rather specialized field, and I'm afraid I haven't looked closely at that. But it would certainly be interesting to look at, because if for example Zanzibar appears on the Kangnido, Zanzibar appears on Luo Hongxian's map, but the name is sometimes written with different characters, and it keeps changing. And so it would be a useful way to try and think about the filiation of maps over time, if you could trace how place names are evolving, because place names were not fixed until the Qing period, foreign place names.
All right, next question asked by Chen Fangfang. I was wondering what you think about the role of nautical chart in Chinese tradition and its contribution to the making of Chuan-Tus in Qing Dynasty.
I take great interest in nautical charts. I see very little impact on the Chuan-Tu tradition. I'm sorry to be doing this to you, but if I could just go forward to, to go to this one. If you'll notice this, the 1767 map by Hong Qianren shows sea routes, and the sea routes are there, depicted there as a kind of white channels across the water. This is the only map in the Chantu tradition that, to my knowledge, shows sea routes. And my sense, and this was when I worked on the Selden map, my sense is that nautical knowledge remained a separate sphere of knowledge that was in the hands of pilots and navigators and did not translate more generally into knowledge that cartographers could use to draw their maps. So you have this, there are also indications of this on the Selden map as well. But generally, nautical charts remained a kind of specialized form of knowledge that did not have much impact. Now, as I say this, I'm already starting to think of some exceptions. In the 16th century, there's a series of maps done of the southeast coast, and they are making use of nautical materials. But they're largely the exception, I think, rather than the rule. And if I can add one more note, it's that the Ortelian model of the world is based entirely on nautical information. Not entirely, but fundamentally on nautical information. Ortelius designed his map of the world so that people could figure out how to sail from point A to point B. That was, and the geometry he uses to imagine the projection is based entirely on nautical travel. So it's what made possible the map of the world that Ortelius created. But I don't see a similar, much of a similar process going on in the Chinese case.
Okay, the very last question. When did the European habit of using colors to distinguish regions on maps originated? When is the color of each country fixed, such as UK is red, French is blue?
Well, this is going to be proof that I'm not a cartographic historian. I should be able to tell you that. And offhand, I can't. I'm trying to think if I can. I don't have any examples in front of me, but it became a particular challenge for European map makers because Europe was divided up into all these countries, and you wanted to make it visually immediate. You wanted the differences of all these countries to be visually immediate. So you had to do that with colors. You do it with lines and it would all get lost. In China's case, China doesn't have the same problem. Of course, eventually China adapts this at the provincial level. And so if we can, run down to this map, different colors distinguish provinces rather than states. So China borrows this, but it borrows it late. And one of the reasons I chose the green and orange map is that I found it visually very pleasing. So that's why I enjoy that version. But the coloring, Chinese don't really start coloring maps as a way of distinguishing spaces until about the beginning of the 20th century. When Europeans start, I'm sorry, I think I'm going to say the 16th century, but as I say, I'm not a cartographic historian.